Good evening and welcome to today's session on BIC Streams. An IIT engineer unpacks wine with Deepak Gulrajani, who will be in conversation with Shoba Narayan. Thank you so much, Deepak and Shoba, for doing this for us. Before I hand over to Shoba, a few quick instructions. For those of you who are here for the first time and would like to receive updates from us, you can do that by visiting our website, or you can follow us on our social media channels, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. With that, welcome everyone, and over to you, Shoba.
Thank you, Raghu, and thank you for doing this, Deepak. I met Deepak by happenstance. I was on a platypus wine tour in California, and one of the stops was at this winery called Nichols Ranch. And there was Deepak behind the table pouring tastings for everybody. And we got talking, and his name was Indian, so we got talking some more, and I learned that he had gone to IIT Mumbai. And then when I looked him up, he was an 86th rank computer science major, IIT Mumbai, which according to my IIT Mumbai classmate friends was like God. So the first question, Deepak, is what does God do in a winery? Why did you start Nichols Ranch, and how did you get there?
I would say a series of fortunate events. Never planned this. I always like to joke, had I ever planned that I was going to have a winery, I would never have done it. I just did it because of things that I love doing. So very fortunate. So, life has a way sometimes of, if you seek it out, you'll get to the point where it was, for me, it seems like it's meant to be of what I enjoy doing. I really enjoy doing it every year.
And your two professions, are there similarities between the way you approach engineering and the way one approaches vineyards and management of vineyards? What would be the pleasure and pain of managing a vineyard?
I mean, I think the engineering background helps a lot, but I would say not in the forefront of what I do, but always in the back of my mind. To be a winemaker is a little bit, it's a creative, artistic endeavor. So to some extent, you using a different part of your brain, more the sensory part of it than the analytical part of it. But the analytical part helps a lot in ahead of harvest, for example, planning out, how things, a plan A, a plan B, a plan C. You need a lot of plans because the weather is going to be the weather. And so you got to be ready for any aspect of it. And all through the process, just being able to take care of wine, because we do so many things in multiple batches. And I'll get to that. I don't want to jump ahead. It becomes kind of an operations problem almost, if you look at it from an engineering point of view. And again, if you can plan that out, you can provide the best care for each component of what you need to do. And if you don't have that logical, analytical, thoughtful way of doing it, if you just stay more kind of on the creative side of things, sometimes what is in front of you only gets the attention, whereas the other 19 things that need attention sometimes get missed out.
So tell us about Nichols Ranch a little bit. How many acres? What kinds of wine varietals do you grow?
Sure. And I'll just put that in context. But as we're bringing up a map of Sonoma, and this is just a Google Earth map of California, Northern California, and then specifically within that is going to be Sonoma. Yeah. But Nichols Ranch is located in Sonoma County. We're on the border with Napa County. So both the counties are side by side.
Yeah. So that's just up above San Francisco. I can see Concord and then Santa Rosa. It's in that area.
Yes, both the Santa Rosa is the county seat, the capital of Sonoma County. I'm about 30 miles south of there, and inland 30 miles from the ocean. Our position relative to the ocean and relative to San Francisco Bay is pretty important because of the fog. This Google Earth shot right now doesn't show you much fog, but typically what shows up as blue, which is the ocean right now, is usually white. And it's very evident, and some of you have probably flown into the Bay Area, especially on an international flight. You're flying over the coastline and we look right from your window, it's all white because it's all fog. And on the left-hand side, you may actually see land. So that fog builds up over the Pacific Ocean because the ocean temperature is usually about 55 degrees. It cools the air and you have a 55-degree layer of fog. In the daytime, as the land heats up, the fog is brought in. And that's a very important component of what makes wine country wine country. It's the temperature, it's the weather from season to season and day and night. So even in summer, when we warm up and we could be as warm as 30 Celsius, 35 Celsius, at night, the fog is going to come in and cool us down all the way down to 55 Fahrenheit, 12 Celsius. For the plants, that's really important. Slowly, we're zooming in where Nichols Ranch is. Nichols Ranch is a 40-acre property that I acquired in 1995. It used to be a cattle ranch, and much of the area where around me were cattle ranches. In fact, if we go back probably 50 years, there were vineyards. There have been vineyards in our area since California has been a state since 1846, but the vineyards have really expanded in the last 50 years. Prior to that, there were a lot of dairy farms, cattle ranches, fruit trees, and so on. But as you can see now on the map, Nichols Ranch is right on the foothills of what is the Mayacamas Range. The Mayacamas, what creates wine country on one aspect is fog, on the other aspect is topography, how the hills and valleys lay down. Why is that important? Because that's what creates the direction of the fog. So the fog comes in from the ocean west to east, but then the hills block it. So if the hills funnel it towards your piece of land, you're going to get more fog. If the hills block it, you're going to get less fog, which means places that have more fog are going to be cooler. Places that have less fog are going to be warmer. And that depends what kind of grapes you can grow. So where I'm situated, right above the bay, and on your screen, if you look at it for a moment, at the bottom, the plain sort of green section is the San Pablo or San Francisco Bay. And I'm almost directly north of it by about 4 miles. So we get fog coming in from the bay, we get fog coming from the ocean. And the way the hills are situated around me is the fog gets funneled a lot onto Nichols Ranch vineyards. Where the fog, Shoba, go.
How does that affect the kinds of grapes that you grow? You were saying that
The Sonoma County is, in terms of area, is pretty significantly large. From south to north, it's about 60 miles. From east to west, it's about 30 miles. And in that piece of land, there are a lot of hills, a lot of valleys, redirecting the fog in many different ways. So Sonoma County as a whole grows many, many different kinds of grapes. And it also has many viticultural areas. Here we call them AVAs, American Viticultural Areas. But because of the microclimates that are created from the combination of fog and the hills, you grow different grapes in different parts of Sonoma County. Where I am is one of the coolest spots in the county, It's one of the coolest spots generally along the coast where the Pinot Noir and Chardonnay are the two varieties that grow best.
Raghu, can you hear Deepak?
Yes, I can, Shoba. Yeah.
Okay, please go ahead.
If you go slightly north of me, about 15 miles or 20 miles north of me, that's where the hills block the fog, and it gets significantly warmer. And in those areas, in fact, on the map, you see something called Arrowhead Mountain Vineyard. We just passed that, but it's significantly warmer, and those warmer areas are better for Cabernet Sauvignon, Zinfandel, and Syrah. So this is, Raghu, this is a really good shot that you're showing. The dark green is actually the highest point on the Mayacamas range. And on the right side is Napa Valley, and on the left side is Sonoma Valley. Okay. These are the two oldest growing areas in all of California. In fact, the oldest winery is still in Sonoma, and it's called Buena Vista Winery. It's founded in 1857. It's about 5 miles from where we are.
Right there, yeah.
But since then, we have learned a lot. As France has been where, especially Chardonnay and Pinot Noir grape growing has been perfected over centuries. Yep. California, we've been very quick adopters and innovators. So we learn quickly, and then we kind of try and figure out how we can improve things. And so constantly for the last 50 years, people have been looking for other places in California besides Sonoma Valley and Napa Valley. Sonoma Valley and Napa Valley probably were founded almost by chance. And chance being one is proximity to San Francisco. We're only about 50 miles north of San Francisco. All of you have heard about the gold rush, which brought a lot of people out for looking for gold or making money off the gold miners, one or the other. And some Italians have, looked at Sonoma and looked at Napa and look at it and go, this just looks like Tuscany or Piedmont. And it actually is. After, some of you have been to Italy as well, our topography, the hills, the valleys, and even the fog to some extent, very similar to parts of Tuscany and Piedmont. So the Italian settlers came out to Napa and Sonoma, and they're the first wineries that were established. But in the last 50 years, people have been searching for other places all up and down the coast of California for topographies that are similar so that you can get that fog coming in. So west of us, where the map, the direction map ends in a town called Occidental. That's the heart of Russian River Valley, which is also part of Sonoma, also a cool climate area, and also well known for Pinot Noir out there. But the Russian River was planted probably starting in the late 60s. And since then, like I said, up and down the coast, so the Sand Harbor. Go ahead. Go ahead, Shoba.
So when they say cool climate grapes, what do they mean?
So typically, cool climate grapes mostly refers to Pinot Noir.
Which is what?
Though Chardonnay will always grow in the same place as Pinot Noir because they're related. The two grapes are actually closely related. Chardonnay is a little more tolerant of different temperatures. Pinot Noir is very sensitive to temperature. So it'll only grow in places which really cool down at night, meaning below 60 Fahrenheit, about 13, 14 Celsius. If it stays warm, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, Pinot ripens too quickly and doesn't have a chance to develop flavors. So there's a difference between ripening and flavor development. Just to describe where we are in the growing cycle right now. In fact, yesterday was the first time I saw something called veraison, and I'll describe that to you. So in early June is when the fruit actually forms. And from June to now, so 5-6 weeks, the fruit becomes larger, but it's rock hard, dark green, and very, very tart. From sometime about now to over the next 2 weeks, the fruit starts softening up and starts turning color. So that is called veraison. And from that point on, the fruit starts sweetening up. So from that point, one, as a farmer, I know how many days or how many weeks it's going to be before harvest. So I can guess that harvest is going to be around first week of September. From now to then, it also depends on how warm it is. If it is extremely hot, that fruit will ripen very quickly, which means it'll get very sweet very quickly. But that does not mean that it's going to make good wine. What you want is a moderate temperature and the cooling down at night, which is going to extend that ripening. And the reason for having that extra, what it provides is extra days in the sunlight. And turns out that the sunlight, the direct sunlight and the UV light that shines on the grapes themselves or fruit themselves is a very important component for developing flavor. And that's true of all grapes. Pinot Noir, however, is the most sensitive to that. In the absence of having that cooler climate, in the absence of having a long growing season, you'll get sweet grapes. You won't have a lot of flavor. You won't have a lot of depth of flavor. So over the next 2 months, what we pray for is moderate temperatures. Cool nights is one constant we always have. It's just the daytime temperature can vary a lot.
And there's nothing you can do as a winemaker to extend that growing cycle?
No, there are small tricks that you can do to extend that. Absolutely. Good question. So if you expect really, really warm weather, there's a lot of leaves obviously on the plant. Because you want flavor development, you want the sunlight to shine on the fruit directly. Very often you actually pull off leaves near the fruit so that it doesn't shade the fruit. So if you're expecting our normal weather, you would actually pull off some leaves. If you're expecting warmer weather, you should not pull off leaves, and that'll shade the plant a little more. So that comes from experience, because one thing that I've noticed, the weather forecasting has only got worse, not better, because our weather is changing, our climate is changing. So our forecasting, which probably depends on historical models, is not as accurate as it used to be. So there's just a lot of guesswork. Sometimes I again joke around, if this vineyard thing doesn't work, I'll become a TV weather forecast. So.
So you talk about the rhythm of your day and through the year. You started by saying veraison and then ripening. So talk about the year and then the day, perhaps, or what is the rhythm of a vineyard?
I think the nice part of being in something connected to agriculture. One, of course, depending on the weather, that sometimes, can be stressful because you don't know what's coming ahead of you. But, there are seasons. There's, winter, spring, summer, and fall. That's going to happen. And your life, the rhythm of your life follows those seasons. I know from now till probably the end of October, I'm going to be busy focusing on the plants. That's really, this is the critical time for the vineyard, and watching every change in the vineyard and trying to make best decisions on my weather forecasts out there. After October, it's paying attention to the wine. The wine goes into barrels. It's going through different stages of fermentation. It's a very, very critical time for wine. Just imagine you took grape, you pulled a bunch of grapes off a plant where it was naturally grown. You squeeze it, you pull out the juice. Now you have the juice, which has a lot of sugar and a lot of flavor. So freshly pressed wine grape juice. In the case of Pinot Noir, if you close your eyes and just swirl a glass of grape juice, it smells like it's a berry cocktail. Raspberries, strawberries, blackberries. It doesn't taste like grape juice at all. But that same juice is going to transform from there to wine, to, I would say, a very young wine in about 6 weeks. So that 6-week period is extremely important because things can also go off track. And when they, so you have to monitor the wine. By when I say monitor, you're smelling, tasting twice a day, multiple batches of wine to find out, is it on track, is it off track?
What are you smelling? What are you?
Yeah. When wine starts fermenting, and I'll step back and talk a little bit about fermentation process. So the fermentation happens, as many of you know, because it's yeast. The yeast eat the sugar and make alcohol. The yeast do many other things. They make many other compounds that make wine from one area to another area distinct, because they produce different kinds of alcohols, different kinds of flavor compounds. But in addition to yeast in a vineyard, you have other microbes, you have other types of non-wine yeast, you have other bacteria. And for all of them, they're hanging out in a vineyard for one purpose only, to get to that sugar, because that's the energy source for them. But if a bacteria starts eating their sugar, one common thing that you'll get is a smell of bad eggs, hydrogen sulfide. So that's a very, very common bad odor you get in wine. And you know immediately, something is going on, which is actually lack of oxygen in there. So you need a little bit of oxygen in there. Sometimes you smell what looks like a nail polish remover, what smells like nail polish remover. Turns out is exactly the same chemical that's a nail polish remover is being produced by a bacteria. It's a bacteria that makes vinegar. And they love sugar as well. So just like that, there are many other odors that you're trying to detect. So actually during the winemaking time, I'm not trying to smell, is this wine good? All I'm trying to detect at that point is the 15 or 20 things that can go wrong, because the earlier you catch it and stop it, you get the wine back on track. Ideally, you don't have any of these issues. So, for example, in a harvest, I may have 20 batches of wine that I may be doing. And in the 20 batches, maybe in 2, I may have a hydrogen sulfide issue pop up. And maybe in another 2, I may have this nail polish remover issue pop up. So it's not very common, but if you're not taking care, it will take over for sure. If I may, I'm going to talk, when I was talking about batches of wine. So I have a 40-acre property, which is planted at 31 acres of primarily Pinot and Chardonnay. We have a small amount of Merlot and small amount of Syrah as well. But our topography is on the foot of the hill. So I have some vineyards which are on the slope of the hill, some of the vineyards that are almost on top of the hill, and some of the vineyards at the bottom of the hill. Just that fact of being flat, sloped, and top of the hill changes the fruit. You could have exactly, and I have exactly the same plant on top, on the slope, and the bottom, and the fruit is going to be different. It requires different care. So they get harvested at different times and fermented separately and kept separately. So that's what we call a batch. The first batch that'll come in is going to be the top of the hillside. And that's going to be harvested by hand, fermented, aged in barrels. And so all along the way, you take it from harvest, juice, fermentation, young wine, aging wine, and then bottling it almost separate in our case as well.
And top because the sunlight is more?
Not so much the sunlight. So in the wintertime and all into the spring, it does cool down quite a lot at night. I mean, it cools down to below freezing a little bit, and that creates frost. And frost is like water as well, which means it flows downhill. So because frost will flow from top of the hill to the bottom of the hill, and it'll collect like water. If you have a low-lying area, it'll collect like water, like a lake. So your low-lying areas have more frost than the top of the hill. And it could make a difference of maybe 2 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit, just 1 or 2 Celsius. But that matters to your growing season. So the top of the hill usually will start budding out, as we call it, in the spring first, and then it'll have flowers first, it'll have fruit first, and it'll usually get harvested first as well.
And yours is a gravity flow vineyard, which means you don't use machinery to get the grape juice inside the barrels?
So a lot about making a good wine has to do with the weather. So I said we've been blessed here in Sonoma and Napa between the fog and the hills with having great weather. Second comes soil, and we'll come back to that. But equally important is how you grow, how you make wine. To get the best wine, you have to be very, very gentle with your fruit, which means when you're harvesting, you hand harvest. So you can take it bunch by bunch. If you machine harvest, which grabs a vine, it'll shake the vine and it'll drop the fruit gets bruised. Bruised fruit, the flavor's already changed. Like it's taking a banana and dropping it, and the bruised part of the banana is not going to taste that good. And then in the winemaking part of it, you have to press the juice, you have to let it ferment, and so on. All along the way, you could use machines, or you could use gravity. So in our case, we use gravity, which means that the winery is designed on 4 different levels. On the topmost level is what we call the crush pad. This is where the grapes arrive. Below that is our tank room. So the tank room has the fermentation tanks, so we can drop the fruit, the berries, straight from the crush pad directly into the tank without using a pump. If it's all on the same level, you would have to use a pump to do that. Once the grapes ferment, it goes down to our caves, which are 30 feet directly below the tank room. So my winery is built on a hill. So I used, again, that hill. It has many advantages. One is to design a gravity flow. All you have to do is create different levels. And certainly you can dig a cave into the hillside directly below your tank room. So that's where the wine's going to age. And the cave itself has a couple of different levels to let the wine flow through its different stages as well. Gravity is going to just be a lot more gentle.
Okay. Deepak, if, as you said, if you step back a little, who would you call a gifted winemaker?
Ultimately, I think like anything, it is.
So how are the winemakers you admire? How are they different? What is your role?
So,
what's a gifted? Who is a gifted winemaker?
I mean, I learned. I would say a lot by observing, talking, and osmosis. When I started coming up to, I got a job in the Bay Area back in the 80s, and very soon started. Anybody who comes to the Bay Area, as you guys know, you're going to get introduced to wine. And that was true 35 years ago. That's true today. But back then there were far fewer wineries. But I started visiting some of the wineries, and the people who impressed me at that time as well were people who grew their own fruit, made their own wine, and did a limited production. They were in it at that point just because for the love of it. Clearly, many of them had to make a livelihood of it. But back then, there was no corporation involved in the wine business at all. There's a joke, what some of you may have heard this, is like, how do you make a small fortune in the wine business? And the answer to that is you start with a large fortune. And it's applied to other things as well. But that's why the big business or any business never entered into wineries and vineyards till probably the late 90s. But
are you in it for livelihood, Deepak? Is this your livelihood?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. 100%. So from 2000, so I've been 100% dedicated to making the wine and running the winery since 2008. I planted the vineyards in 1995, and I continued working my day job at that point, all the way till 2008. The winery started in 2003, and as you know, when you start any business, it takes a little while to get it on its feet. And in the wine business in particular, there's a very long lead time to get it to a place where you go, okay, this may actually work. So it takes a lot.
COVID impacted the Sonoma in a major way?
Certainly has. Certainly has. I have been very fortunate, and anybody in our wine business or agriculture, been fortunate that we have been allowed to continue farming, continue winemaking from day one. So that provided me my routine, right? And as many, if you have that routine, you know, my world is getting rocked and everybody's world is getting rocked. However, the routine provided some sort of sense of normalcy, stability to actually think straight a little bit.
Yeah.
But it has impacted everybody economically. For sure, we were shut down for 3 months. We've been open for about a month. There's a risk of us getting shut down again. As many of you read, like California, you know, COVID numbers are going up a lot. So this is actually, as of on Thursday, Napa County is going to shut down indoor restaurants and indoor wine tasting and anything indoors. And so that's a little bit of reversal. So, and that's unfortunate.
There's a listener question which segues exactly to what you were in the middle of. What makes an aged wine full-bodied and smooth vis-a-vis
vis-a-vis a new wine, a young wine? So aging has, of course, there's some barrel aging, bottle aging, and then there's really maturing of a wine. So all my wines typically go through 2 years of time in barrel, 2 years of time in bottle before we actually start serving it or selling it. And then you can keep my wines and many good wines for another 10, 20 years. That's sort of the maturing period. So all these different stages actually have different impact on the wine. The grape juice takes about 6 weeks to ferment, goes through a second fermentation called malolactic, and we'll get to that. But in about 3 months, it technically is a wine that you can drink. And many of you probably have drunk Nouveau Beaujolais. Yeah. Nouveau Beaujolais is a very young wine that was released sometime end of November of the same harvest. So it was harvested in September, it's released by the end of November. So technically, you can have a wine ready. However, that young wine, and you drink Nouveau Beaujolais, is going to be very fruity, a little bit tart. Sometimes you may want to chill it down, even if it's a red wine. But that same wine, so that same region of France, which is Beaujolais, creates a wine that is aged as well. So that same Nouveau Beaujolais, if you leave it in a barrel for 1 year or 2 years, the barrel will transform the texture and the flavors. And it does not have to be a new barrel. So a new barrel will add its own flavors of vanilla and spice. Even an old barrel allows the wine to breathe, and that breathing process, which is wine gradually evaporating through the wood of the barrel, that transforms the texture and the flavor of the wine. So what's called Cru or Premier Cru Beaujolais is very different from Nouveau Beaujolais.
And it softens the wine.
It softens up the wine. I learned this very early on. I am a winemaker today because all those wine tasting days back in the 80s, and being an engineer, I guess, and being curious, I started making wine with a couple of friends. So we'd make wine in a garage. Fortunately, I think somebody gave us good advice and said, use a barrel. So even though we were making garage wine, we were making it in a commercial sized barrel, which can make about 300 bottles of wine. And we'd make some wine in glass jars and plastic jugs and all of that. And the same juice, night and day. You know, something that was sitting in a glass jug, okay, however big it may be, versus something that went in the barrel. And that was just an eye opener for somebody who was a novice in wine, going, wow, all I did was put it in a barrel, nothing else. But commercial wineries still don't always do that. Why? Because it's expensive. Why? Because you got to pay attention to each barrel. Each barrel is about 200 25 liters only. Whereas if you're a big commercial winery making a lot of wine, you could have a gigantic tank, which is 10,000 liters. It takes the same amount of time to monitor, meaning taste or measure and chemistry experiments on it, on a 10,000 liter tank as it does on a 225 liter barrel. So that's why barrels, people who are trying to make great wine will always use barrels.
Yeah. Does it matter whether it's French oak or American oak or stainless steel barrels?
Yeah, and so that is a stylistic choice. Whether you keep wine in stainless steel, whether you age it in wood, and what kind of oak, French oak, American oak, are probably the two most distinct kinds. The flavors, so if you want to make a crisp, fruity wine, you want to keep all the fruit flavors that were presented, that came from your main ingredient, the grape. So you want to ferment that in stainless steel. Stainless steel is going to protect all the flavors. It's not going to transform them. It's not going to add anything to it. But however, you cannot keep it in steel for a long time. So that's for a young wine, a Sauvignon Blanc, a Pinot Grigio, that in 6 months you want to bottle and drink. You typically do that in stainless steel. Once you make the
alcohol? So finish, Deepak.
Yeah, once you make the decision that you want to use a barrel because you want more layered wine with lots of flavor, different kind of texture, then the choices are what kind of oak you want to use. French oak will give to a white wine flavors of vanilla and caramel and butterscotch and brown sugar, and to a red wine it typically gives more spice flavors, cinnamon and clove, in the nutmeg in there. Whereas American oak is a little bolder. It actually gives more of like a note of coffee, of molasses, like gourd almost to some extent to that. So it's a little bit bolder. Traditionally, everybody used French oak because if you go back 200 years, there was no American barrels. But now there are. So people use American oak on wine as well. But American oak, if many of you have tasted bourbon, 100% of the taste of bourbon comes from American oak. Bourbon is just distilled corn, which has no taste till it sits in American oak.
Deepak, you mentioned the taste of coffee, nuts, and spices. You can obviously taste that. How does one cultivate that palate? What did you do?
Did a lot of research. No, did a lot of wine drinking. Like I said, as soon as I came to the Bay Area, which was in 1988, I was fortunate to work for a startup, which we worked hard, and this was a software startup, but it had people from many countries working there. We were only 50 people, and I think there were 15 or 20 countries represented. My boss was a gentleman from France. And so it was a bunch of young people. They did wine tasting once a week at the company itself. And they brought some very, very good wines. So I was fortunate, like almost the first wine I ever tasted was a very good level of wines. And then had the opportunity to come up to Napa and Sonoma, which is just an hour away from San Francisco, from the Bay Area, and actually meet the people and taste very good wines. So that sets a standard already, and that intrigued me. And I traveled a lot to France and Italy and tasted a lot of wine. So I call it my research, but it was just a fun thing to do. I never imagined that point that it'd be a commercial or
if I give you a blind taste, a bottle covered with paper, you can taste it and tell me what it is.
I used to be better at it. Like I would say probably 20 years ago than I may be today. And I'll tell you why. When I was doing my research phase, right, or enjoying phase, I would try many, many different types of wine. And one of the ways I also learned more about wines is I made friends with similar interests in wine. And we'd have our own little wine tasting group, and we'd make it say, okay, this year or this month, we're going to focus on Rioja, which is a Spanish wine, because I knew nothing about it. And we'd focus on Rioja and try and kind of get wines from the same vintage and taste that carefully, do blind tastings, share our opinions. Over the years, I've become more and more sort of centered on Sonoma and Napa. I do enjoy visiting other countries and tasting wines, but now it's more for pure enjoyment than with the curiosity of learning. So I was probably a better somm 20 years ago than I am today. Because today I just care more about, is it a good wine? Is it a great wine? Or is it, I'm not going to spend my time on it. But I'm not as interested anymore of the intellectual curiosity of, which vintage and which vineyard and all. So
this is also related to winemaking. And I would like to spend some time on buying and tasting wines, which is what a bulk of Indians who don't have access to Napa and Sonoma will want to do. So I would like to spend a little bit of time from you learning how can you value wine? How do you buy a bottle? How do you taste wine? But one question related to winemaking is also from a viewer is the percentage of alcohol in wines, like in California, why are they creeping up? It's 14%, 14.2, 15%, but Alsace it is 12.5 and 13.
So what Shoba is talking about is a distinction between what people call old world wines and new world wines. Old world wines, primarily coming from France, Italy, Germany, and so on, were, and I'll underline that word, were typically lower alcohol and slightly higher acidity, and a less full-bodied. That was a style that they made wine. And that style still really good, very food-friendly. And I guess partly that's why they did it, because wine was so much part of their culture, that you have wine but typically with every meal. So wines that went along and complemented your meal were probably more appreciated than something that was maybe less so. Higher alcohol wines sometimes are less food friendly, but higher alcohol, the goal for New World wines wasn't so much higher alcohol. The goal for New World wines a little bit was, how do we get more flavor? And one thing that I said earlier is flavor comes with a long growing season. Sometimes because of the length of the growing season, you're going to have higher sugar as well. You'll get more flavor, but you're going to have higher sugar. Higher sugar in your grape translates to higher alcohol. That's just how nature is going to work. Every grain of sugar, every drop of sugar in the grape juice is going to be converted to alcohol by the yeast. So New World wines, with our search for trying to get more flavor, has resulted also in higher alcohol. The other part of it is a lot of New World places, California included, but I would say Australia and Chile are typically a little warmer than France in particular. And just that heat allows us to get more flavor, but also get consequences, more sugar.
Right. One more process question. Are there specific, this is from a listener, are there specific strains of yeast used to ferment wine, cultured or introduced for this process, or is fermentation done by whatever yeast is in the air in the area?
No, that's a really good question. So there's typically only one wine yeast species called Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the wine yeast that is used practically by everybody. However, within Saccharomyces, there's a lot of different strains. It's a yeast that actually mutates quite easily, and actually because of that, it's one of the microbes that is used a lot in research for biofuels and things like that as well. So every yeast, every commercial yeast is also Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but different strains. Where did these strains come from? So yeast, their reason for existence is to get sugar. So they hang out in the vineyards. They hang out wherever there's any sweet fruit, whether there's banana or mangoes as well. So the yeast have been around a lot longer than we've been around. But from vineyard to vineyard, the yeast could be slightly different. How do you know that? Before we could do DNA and all of that stuff, people knew that from how the wine tasted. And you could taste the juice, then you could taste the wine. And in different vineyards, there was slightly different transformations happening in terms of different aroma. The way a yeast expresses itself, besides making alcohol, I said it makes many other compounds, is through aromatic compounds. So the distinct signature of yeast is what aroma it's giving to the wine. So you're going to have aroma from the fruit itself. So and sometimes that's the dominant aroma. The yeast is going to add aroma as well. So you have to be able to distinguish yeast aroma from fruit aroma, and then yeast aroma from a particular type of yeast, and then another one. So way back when, the people identified, oh, I love this yeast that comes from Burgundy, or love this yeast that comes from this vineyard in Bordeaux. And once they got the technology, which was a couple of 100 years ago now, of actually propagating the yeast in a kitchen or a lab, right? If anybody has made bread, or actually in India, we're talking about idlis and so on, those are fermented things. The fermentation is all a product of yeast. Somewhere back then, they found a yeast that they liked. So somebody cultivated it and then freeze dried it, so you can buy a bag of yeast. And there's probably 20 varieties of yeast you can buy if you go into your wine shop. So 99%, maybe even 99.9% of worldwide wine is made from one of those commercial yeasts. That said, many people who are trying to make great wine will not use a commercial yeast. So I do not use a commercial yeast. I use the yeast that comes from my vineyard. So it's—
How do you get it?
It's just, they're naturally always there, and every vineyard naturally always has it. Most people don't like to use it because they're not sure about how it's going to ferment it, whether that yeast is going to give them bad odors. The commercial yeast have been studied, charted, day one of fermentation, what should the alcohol level be? What should the aroma compounds be? You can send a sample to the lab and it's on track. You don't have to rely on your nose. So, and how long the fermentation will take, which again, if you're a large winery, the logistics matter. You need the tank for another batch, so on.
So forgive me for interrupting you, Deepak. There are 10 questions on process, so
okay,
I'm going to just shoot them
yeah,
at you.
Absolutely. Then please feel free to interrupt. As you can see, I can go on and on. So keep me on track.
Yeah, because then we want to talk about economics of wine and why does wine cost $1,000 and why do your wines cost $75 and
okay.
no.
So could you repeat the question? Sorry, I had a little glitch here.
So how is the percentage determined? How is the alcohol percentage determined?
So you can measure the alcohol level in wine. You can have the equipment in your own lab or send it out to an outside lab, just like you would do a blood test, to sample that. So you can do, that's how you'd measure it. And it can vary. In California wines, it's going to be 14% all the way up to 16%. Old world wines, many are lower than 14, but with time, the success of California wine has led to old world winemakers trying to emulate California. So that's what it's. So yes, you're going to find some old world winemakers who's more traditional, but many who go, wow, that wine, California wine seems to sell. Why don't I make some the same way? Yeah. And so that's been happening too. But the other part of it is the old world is getting warmer. And part of the new world, the reason new world wines are higher alcohol, because we are typically have warmer climate. But the old world is getting warmer too.
Sachdev asks, are grapes washed and before squeezing them for the juice or not? Why is it that they are not washed?
Good question. So they are not. So first answer is they are not washed.
Yeah, so, actually his question was, why is it that grapes are not washed before squeezing them for the juice? That was his question.
So I think one is because The reason you don't wash them is you don't want to introduce water into it. If you have a little bit of water in it, you would probably be introducing that in there. That's one part of it. The second part of it is there's no real benefit from washing the grapes. For example, if you may have dust, it's out in the field, the wind blows, you have dirt on the grapes. In through the fermentation process and what we call settling, all those tiny dust particles will actually settle eventually to the bottom of your tank or your barrel, which at some point you may remove just through gravity or some other process. So all the impurities, so to speak, that are there, you will be removed. The second reason is, in my case, for sure, we want to keep the yeast that's on the skins of the grapes. So we don't want to wash them out. Some of them will get washed out, some of them will stay. So we actually want them.
Okay. And what is the role of the cork in the wine bottles? Asks Suman Sasmal.
A very important role, and it's not just purely aesthetic, and it's not just purely traditional. Those two, aesthetic and tradition, also important for the cork. However, it's probably the only way of closing a bottle that allows the wine to continue to mature. Remember I talked about barrel aging, then bottle aging, and then maturing for years, maybe a decade or two. Only a cork, because it's the bark of a tree, it's the bark of the cork oak tree, which primarily grows in Portugal, it protected the tree, but allowed the tree to transpire, to breathe. So the same cork, what it did for the tree, does it for wine. Allows the wine to transpire and breathe. But at a rate, it's called micro-oxygenation. So just tiny amount of oxygen going through those channels in the cork into the wine. Without a cork, if you had a tight closure, screw top, any other synthetic cork and so on, there's no oxygen going in. So your wine is almost like canned. And if any of you have opened canned vegetables, green beans, as my favorite example, open an old can of green beans and open it up, you're going to get this pungent smell of sulfide, same that H2S. And that's what happens to wine. It gets this H2S sulfide in it. So wines that are going to be drunk soon, Pinot Grigio, Sauvignon Blanc, Nouveau Beaujolais, or other Zinfandel, within a year or two, you can put any kind of closure, screw top, all of that. It's not going to hurt the wine at all. Those closures are cheaper. Putting a cork doesn't add anything. A wine that you're going to keep 5 years, 10 years, you should be using a cork.
So moving to the next aspect of what would be your advice if your son or if a friend asks, Deepak, I'm going to a duty-free shop. I want to pick up some good wine. How do I do it?
So I'd say the first and foremost thing, and I'll then amplify on it, but in terms of having access, like, store duty-free, first and foremost, I would say pick on the basis of a region. So that's what shows through the most. So if you're looking for California wine and specifically Pinot Noir, hands down, I'd say you pick something from Sonoma. Mm-hmm. If you're looking for a Cabernet, you have a little more choice. Some people may choose Napa, but Bordeaux produces very, very good Cabernet as well. So I think knowing the regions are probably the most important. So those appellations that show up on the labels are pretty important. That's not the sole thing that's important. The second thing is who makes the wine, the producer. And some large producers do a fabulous job of producing great wine. So just knowing a little bit about the producer, of how they make it, or just from your experience, having tasted a bottle from that producer and saying, I like that taste, that is equally important. So I think if you just walk into a store, those are the first two things I'll look at: region, then producer, and third, maybe vintage. Vintage, even I have to then open up my Google to actually look at a vintage chart. Nobody remembers that at all. But if you get those first two things right, the region and producer, you probably have a pretty good wine already.
Yeah.
Now, if you have the opportunity, when you visit, going to France or Italy or California, then it's a very different game. So in the sense, you're not limited to what's on the store shelf and what can be exported. Now you have this wide open opportunity to try producers who are making it in small quantities, growing their own grapes, doing it different ways, and never exporting their wine. So if I go to Italy, for example, completely new region that I don't know, say Southern Italy somewhere, the things that I look for are producers that grow their own grapes. That's the first and foremost thing, because I already know that they're going to produce a higher level of wine than somebody who purchases fruit. So that's the first thing. And then I know smaller producers, people have been doing it for a long time, are generally going to have better wine. It matter to them. It's more the real pride in the product, besides it being, selling a product. There's a real pride to it, which shows through in the wine as well. So I'll always look out for smaller producers who grow their own grapes. Usually those wines are never available in a store. So that's why I was drawing the distinction.
For many people, though, this takes time to collect this information. What is a price point below which you can say it's mass-produced wine? And if you, is there a cutoff, for example?
So that depends a little from country to country, I'm region to region. So I'll give you some ideas. California wine, and then at California prices that you can buy in a store here.
Yes.
And it depends on what kind of grape. So let's approach the peak of this, right? Napa Cabernet. So Napa Cabernet, as many of you know, there are bottles that sell for $500 or $1,000, and potentially you can probably find a bottle that sells for $25. That's probably the widest range there is. It's probably the only American wine that even sells at those high prices. So why?
But Screaming Eagle and all of those, Harlan Estate, Colgan,
more than $1,000 even. And then, where is the cutoff for where you think you can get a good Napa Cabernet? The short answer is probably at about $75 for a Napa Cabernet. Anything above that is probably going to be pretty good. Okay, anything below that, just be a little more careful. It doesn't mean you can't get a very good bottle at $40. You can, but you have to really know the producer. About $75, I think all producers do a pretty good job. Now, once you get over $150, is that wine worth it? Again, you better know the producer. Now, everybody who sells $150 wine is not necessarily that wine you're going to say, that's as good as a $75, maybe even as good as a $50 wine. But there are going to be some producers who you go, wow, this is exceptional. So I'd say that for Cabernet, and this is the high end of it. Okay, Cabernet is the most expensive wine coming out of California. But that $75 to $150 range is where you can't miss. Yeah. Below and above, you better know more. Yeah. When you come to Pinot Noir, which is what I specialize in, the prices are much lower. And Pinot Noir, I would say anything about $50. So Pinot Noir in the 50 to 75 range is probably, again, can't miss. Again, as long as it comes from Sonoma. Below 50, yes, there are some that people make, really good ones. And above, 75, you better know the producer. If you're going to pay $200 for a Pinot Noir, you better, know the producer, and is it worth it or not? And worth it is a matter of perception.
Correct.
So $1,000 Cabernet, a $200 Pinot Noir, $1,000 Burgundy, that's more a matter of perception whether it's worth it. From a flavor point of view, I think that sweet spot, the can't miss spot for California Pinots, 50 to 75 is a really good spot. Now, uh, I'll highlight an example. So my love of Pinot has led me to go to Burgundy, which is the birthplace of Pinot Noir, many, many times. And the prices of Burgundies, because over, especially the last 30, 40 years, the demand has gone up so much that the prices, bottles that I could afford 30 years ago, I can't afford today, or I would not spend the money today on. The prices have gone up so much. And the wines are very good, but are they worth it? Don't know, right? So you travel 50 miles south of Burgundy and you come to Beaujolais, Land of Nouveau Beaujolais, and you can get a lot of premier cru Beaujolais, which are $30 versus paying $500 for a good Burgundy. So just regions become famous, but you can find wine at very good prices. So from California, one of the best wine values tends to be Zinfandel, which many of you have probably tasted. So Zinfandel, I'd say again, in the 30 to 60 range, it probably is a can't miss. And below 30, you can probably at $20 find a good Zinfandel if you know what you're doing. And so from every region in France, like I said, Beaujolais is going to be like that. Italy grows so many different kinds of grapes that the grapes that are less well known and the regions that are less well known will probably produce great wines at lower prices. So sometimes if you want to do that and explore, look for a region that you don't know, read about it, and then go buy a bottle, open it, see if you like it. Ultimately it depends on your taste.
An Italian sommelier said Nero d'Avola is a little known grape outside Italy, but it's become famous now, I think.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Your different grapes will may have their day in the sun, so to speak. But there's the one fun part about traveling for me is discovering new things, and in specifically discovering new wines. So there's so many grapes that I've not tasted.
So this is a question from Reva Singh, who puts out this amazing magazine called Sommelier India, which I will send you a PDF of. What do you think of Pinot Noir from Oregon as opposed to Sonoma?
So Oregon has less sunshine. Oregon is it's on the coast, has some of the same benefits of the fog, cooler climate, but because it's north of here and the way our weather patterns work, has less sunshine and sometimes more rain than California. What that translates to is Oregon, truly you have to pay attention to the vintages. California, I'd say vintage matters less. Yes, we do have some great and some not so great, but California, if you ignore the vintage, you're still okay. In Oregon, not as much. So you have to be more vintage specific because you can have a really variation from year to year. That's one part of it. The second part of it is if you like wines, so more old world style Pinot Noir, so more like old Burgundy used to be, more earthy, a little more spice driven than fruit driven, little lighter bodied. Oregon's going to produce wines more like that than California is, again, because it's far cooler.
This question is from Bikram Jeet. What kinds of wines would you need to mature in a bottle for a long time?
I would say any red wine is probably benefit from bottle aging. Why do I say that? Because red wines have more tannins in them. And tannins are what create the bitterness and the texture. It's like what black tea has. If you steep boil your tea a lot, it's going to become more bitter if you just drink in black. And that's the tannins being extracted from the tea. And red wines just naturally have more tannins. And so it depends obviously how the wine was made, but it will have more tannins to start with. Some winemakers intentionally want to pull out more tannins and that will allow that wine to age for a very long time. But I think any red wine benefits from bottle aging. Now, a short way of bottle aging is put it in any glass pitcher, or if you want to put in a fancy decanter and swirl it around. And it'll age the wine very quickly in a matter of an hour. So if a red wine tastes harsh to you, astringent, tannic, the easy way to rectify it, aerate it, put it in a decanter, or you get these tiny aerators which you can put on top of the neck of the bottle, and it'll soften up the wine right away.
Sachdev asks, what are your views on collecting wine as a rare asset, which is about?
For me, I think that's I don't think that's a good endeavor, personally. I was trying to find a kind word.
Yeah.
Wine to me is meant to be enjoyed with friends, family, special occasion, with your pizza daily. And so I don't look at it as an asset in that term. I look at it, enjoy it for its sensory qualities, and I cannot get its sensory qualities if it's sitting in the bottle. I have to open the bottle.
So my friend Chetan Kamani asks, do old vintage wines that have the potential to age really make that big a difference in the overall drinking experience? Or is it just getting into snoot value? Is more care required to preserve them, or is the risk factor of storing them worth it?
No, that's a good question to see whether, if you don't store them properly, what's the point in saying it's aged 10 years if it's not stored properly? Absolutely. Is it worth it? That again depends on your taste. The flavor that you're going to get in a matured wine, the only way you're going to taste that is in a matured wine. So once you taste that, and if you like it, you will want to age your wines. Now, I don't mean the flavor is going to be that different. I'll take Pinot Noir again because that's my specialty as an example. A young Pinot Noir is going to show more fruit, more of that red berry cocktail that I talked about. That's going to show up in, and I say young Pinot Noir, something that is 3 years old. That same bottle, let it sit for another 2 years. It's going to show a little more spice component to it. Let it sit another 2 years. Now you're going to get fruit, you're going to get spice, but then now you're going to get components that you don't absolutely recognize. Most sort of sensory people say it has the taste of umami, which is a savory component of taste that starts showing up in an older wine. And what things, any food, all of you have something that is favorite food and something like that, and you always go back to. And umami has this quality of once you taste it, it's something you really want to go back to, I think. And that's why people who like wines that are aged will look for that. And it also, that aging has the young wine, fruit. Slightly matured wine, fruit and spice. It's a little older wine, fruit, spice, umami, maybe some other flavors that are there. I'm just broadly put it under umami, but people call it earthiness and so on. And so you get many layers of flavor. The wine becomes so much more interesting. You will savor each sip. In fact, after each sip, you kind of wonder, what that flavor was. So it really grabs your attention. And beyond sort of just the sensory part of it, I think when it grabs your attention, you can think about all these flavors. I think it really immerses you in something out of what you are doing in your daily life, where your brain is just pulled in, and your sense, your body, your whole being is pulled in a little bit.
Two related questions. What does Padu asks, what does Deepak think about Indian wines? And Suman asks, the grapes, a simple dumb question, the grapes that are usually available and sold in India, what types are they? That's not vinifera, I don't think. I think the Indian grapes are something else.
So the first question, Indian wines have improved tremendously. And to be frank, last time I was in India was winter of 2017. So it's been 2.5 years. So the reason I point that out, what I notice is every couple of years, things keep changing. So India is at the point where things change quite fast in the wine world. in California, we kind of hit probably some stability there. So I've been actually quite impressed. I mean, back in 2005 and 2006, I actually did probably the most conscious effort to learn about Indian wine. And I was thinking of doing something maybe in the wine business in India back then. So I spent a lot of time meeting some growers and tasting wines and so on. A lot has changed since then. I mean, every time I go back, I find wines. I go, this wine's actually pretty good. Even Sula makes a pretty good, very good Syrah. And clearly those are the big brand names, and Grover is a pretty big brand name. Grover makes some decent, very decent wines that are there. But even like the Fratelli, I think, for me, a newer producer, I wasn't sure whether it was an Italian import. Turns out it's an Indian wine. They make some decent wines too. So especially the Chenin Blancs, quite good. And on the reds, again, the wine like Syrah or Tempranillo, I don't know if I've tasted Indian Tempranillo, but that would be well suited to Indian climate. The wines I would not taste would be a Pinot Noir from India, because it's just the climate's not suited. But, it's really matching the grape that works in that climate and just finding a good producer. There are many small producers in India as well. And sometimes it's tough for small producers there too. But there people like me there now too, who are doing it because they fell in love with it first, and then they make a livelihood out of it.
And the grapes, the edible grapes, I think the one question was about the grapes in India.
Edible. So we have our edible grapes they're grapes. They're related in some way to wine grapes. They are sometimes slightly different species of grape almost. So wine grapes called Vitis vinifera, and it comes specifically because nowadays we can do DNA and all of that stuff. That they found some location in the country of Georgia where they think all of this originated. But generally in that area of the Black Sea and almost into Armenia and those areas. But there are grape varieties in many other countries, and there are Native American grape varieties as well. And then people, just like we have bred dogs and cows, and to get different species, bred grapes. And the table grapes that we get are ones that, one, need to look good, nice and plump, right? And then when you put it in your mouth, should be refreshing, nice and juicy, with hint of flavor, hint of acidity. But I think the juicy component is the highlight. And then if you want to pop it in your mouth, if you have a chewy skin, you got to spit out the skin, and it's like, doesn't look nice. So they breed a grape that has a thin skin. Seeds are bitter. Who wants to crunch on seeds? So they breed a grape that doesn't have seeds. And so wine grapes are the complete opposite of that. Thick skins, seeds, not juicy at all. But what they lack in all of that, flavor. They have flavor.
Shamana,
and the size is pretty different. Size, like wine grapes, typically a good wine grapes are the size of a pea. And just imagine your table grape,
It's huge, relatively, yeah. Shamana asks, is red wine made from red or black grapes as opposed to white or green grapes? Dumb question, I know. So
Not entirely, because so to backtrack, some sommeliers, and some of you are, you get these black glasses, wine glasses, so that you can't even detect the color of the wine, whether it's a white wine or a red wine. So if you want to do a proper blind tasting and say, yeah, one of these things like, which grape is it, which region, all of that, you can maybe even do it in these black glasses. So at some level, you can't tell between white and red. And certainly, I said we are now at the first stage of variation where the color starts turning. So clearly when I walk into my vineyard, I know, hey, that's a Pinot because it's turning red. But exactly a week back, if I walked into somebody else's vineyard, I couldn't tell between white or red at all. Now, all white wines, no, let me phrase this. All red wines are made from red grapes. But the color of all those red wines comes from the skin of the grapes, not the juice of the grapes. So all red wines are fermented or soaked with their skins. so that the juice will absorb all the color. So the juice of red grapes, almost all red grapes, is actually white. So you can make a white wine from red grapes. Okay, and all white wines will come from, green or yellow, golden yellow grapes. So I'll just add one thing. The one classic one where you get a white wine from red grapes is champagne, sparkling wines. Sparkling wines typically are a blend of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and they don't have to be a rosé. So they don't have to be pink at all. They can be completely that golden, light gold champagne color and be made entirely from Pinot Noir, which is a red grape.
Aram asks, why do some wines have 4 to 5% residual sugar?
So that's again matter of style, I'd say. So a dessert wine, which is meant to be sweet, typically would have that, but some other, what may be considered a table wine, may also have that level of sugar. So that's a matter of taste. To the Indian palate, they may say, well, people like sweet wines. So, or to a novice wine drinker, the fruit and the sugar, that combination tastes good. So a lot of people, even in California, will say, do you have a sweet wine? So I think it's just because we, as we're growing up, or as our palate is maturing, we have that, we like sweet things. I said, yeast love it. We like sweet things. So a dash of sweetness pulls in more people. However, sweetness hides a lot. It hides a lot of flavors. So it'll show the fruit flavors, but the sweetness will completely overwhelm any umami flavor you have in that wine. You just hid what may be the best part of the wine. So sugar is a good way of fixing a wine. If you have not a very good wine, you put a little bit of sugar, you improve it in some ways. Yeah.
Deepak, I want to ask you about China, India, in the trend sense. Are Chinese buyers still defining the market? How has the wine landscape changed?
So I'll talk in broad terms, and I'll talk specifically for me. In broad terms, I think the reason Napa Cabernets are $1,000 is the Chinese market. 100% absolutely, and it's not because they're going to open the bottle. It's kind of going to be stored or traded or gifted or any of those things. And the reason Burgundies are at $750 or $1,000 is the same reason, really. So that's one end of it. The other positive end of it, it has allowed a lot of $20 wines to be made and good $20 wines being made, even in California, but I would say more Australia, Chile, Argentina, because there is so much bigger market of China, India, all of that. It has brought, so at one end, you got people chasing, the cult wine, but it has allowed exposure, access, and a market for for us. You guys are providing us a market, right? And for you, you're getting exposure to all these different varieties coming from Italy or South Africa and so on. So it's certainly expanded the wine world. Even for us, it's improved it for us. Like, I may not have tasted a wine from South Africa otherwise, maybe. But now
and in the future, going forward, will it be the same? Will China continue to dominate the buying landscape?
I think, yeah, absolutely, and India too. That's just a question of numbers. Larger population, more exposure to wine, more appreciation. Even my 35 years of living in California, I've seen it change just in California, in the US, where, the population was whatever the population in the US, but the drinking population or the wine appreciating population in the US has expanded so much in the last 35 years. Like, we didn't have wine tourists here 10 years ago, meaning just within our domestic market. Now we have domestic tourists and international. So,
which segues to a question from Nina David. What is it about wine growing or processing that has sustained your engagement with it over all these years? So why are you still a winemaker?
I love, and I'll tell you, like, the singular sort of picture or experience in my mind is the first day of harvest. I was telling Shoba, said, you have to wake up early for this call and go like, yeah, it's getting me ready for harvest. You wake up really early. You get out there in the field just before dawn and you're on the back of a tractor. I am harvesting every day that we harvest, because the quality of the fruit that comes in is what's going to result in the quality of the wine. But just seeing the fruit on the vine before it's picked, just at that moment, right at dawn, you got this fog that has put dew on the plants, and the sun just coming up. It's a magical moment. And for me, I've been doing it for so many years. It is so much the thing that provides me energy, and just the whole thing flashes through my mind of what kind of wine is this going to make. It almost kind of informs me, what life is, at least for me. So for me, harvest and winemaking is really and this didn't come to me, I think it's just grown into me over the years.
Sachdev asks, sorry, Deepak.
Go ahead.
As Sachdev asks, as climate issues become important, can winemakers manage microclimates around their vineyards?
Oh, tough one. Yeah, tough one. Something we think about all the time. I said what makes Napa Sonoma special is our fog and our terrain, which directs the fog. And that's a question always on my mind, is how is climate change going to change the fog pattern? I'm less concerned about the average temperatures and all. The temperatures do matter because we get more hot days than we used to. We certainly do that, but there's ways you can manage around that. Decisions you make on when to harvest, what you need to do, whether you need to pull leaves, whether you need to irrigate if you need to irrigate. So those heat spikes, there's ways to manage it. But if the fog pattern changes, which I've been watching very carefully, I have friends who are scientists in this area on weather. They say it's very hard to predict. So far, nothing has changed. But they say fog is probably going to be the hardest thing to predict, because it's a function of both ocean temperatures, current, land temperature heating up, and all of that. So, but you to think, what would you do? When you plant a vineyard, the vineyard will last 30 to 40 years. I'm right at middle age. My vineyard is right about 22, 23 years. My Pinot vineyards, I'm hoping go well past 40 years. My Chardonnay vineyards, I may have to, some of them are looking, they get diseases as well. So maybe in 5 or 7 years, I'll replant. What would I replant? Should I be putting Cabernet, which requires a warmer temperature? Should I put in Tempranillo because it's going to get so warm, which is a Spanish grape and which will do well in India? So, yep, those are questions always ask and research and so on. People have planted research vineyards. Some people have planted 5 different varietals to see how well they would do, and then make a decision from there.
We have 5 minutes, and so the last question is from Hemant, and it links to what I want to ask. Hemant's question is, are there organic grapes grown? And if so, the wines made from them, are wines made from them? And of course, the answer is yes, but you can please elaborate on that. And my question is the future going to be more organic? What is the future of winemaking in terms of trend?
Very, very few wines are actually organic. There are there, but they're very few. Then I grow my grapes organically. My grapes are all organic. My wine is not, and the only reason my wine is not, we put sulfite in the wine, which allows the wine to age. An organic wine, if it was sulfite-free wine, you'd have to drink it very early. It would not. You cannot age it. But even I grow my grapes organically, but there are very, very few organic vineyards. even here in California. And I say even here because California, we talk about fresh and farm to table cuisine and so on. Surprisingly, the vineyards, most of the vineyards are not organic, and mainly for one reason alone, which is a weed killer called Roundup. Roundup is very, very efficient in controlling, killing weeds that are underneath the vines. That most farmers don't like the weeds because they think it'll take nutrition away from the grapevine, and Roundup is just very efficient. But there's, people think that's a chemical that goes into the soil, and it's not. There's research on both sides which say it's harmful to microorganisms, or it doesn't affect microorganisms. Research which indicates there's the essential chemical in it, which is called glyphosate, shows up in the wine itself, but it's in parts per billion. And so you may say it doesn't matter, but the way I look at it, I drink my wine every day, maybe parts per billion, but I can add up those parts per billion and suddenly I may go, 30 years from now, that may not be a great idea. So I didn't do it from a health reason, from being organic. I'm always trying to constantly figure out how do we get more flavor, more. So that's over the years. I started off as a conventional farmer because I did not know any better. It's what people told me. And as I learned more and more, I did dry farming, which is no irrigation. I went to using my vineyard yeast, and now we're organic as well.
So my phone is exploding with questions, but we've unfortunately run out of time. Sorry, guys. Deepak, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to BIC and to me. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to say a couple more words. One is to thank you, Shoba, and thank BIC for allowing me to participate and just letting me chatter on about wine. But any one of you, if you have more questions, feel free to email it to me. I don't know if my email is up on here, but
we will share it.
Yeah, or go to our Nichols Ranch website. I actually pick up the emails from there as well. As a small winery, so I grow my own grapes, and the only place you can taste my wine is at my location itself. So we've, it's become less common to have an estate winery, but also means we're a small enterprise, which means I pick up the phones and read the emails as well. So.
No, but one thing our listeners and viewers should know is that you sell through a membership list. You're not, we can't find your wines in the shop. We have to either email you for it or visit you for it.
Yeah, and that's the last point. Please come visit anytime. Send me an email. Say I'm visiting. I heard your talk at BIC, and I just want to come visit. It is wine country here, and wine country anywhere is always beautiful. The weather, yes. What the weather of the grapes like, we love. So yes. It's always a great place to visit, and you'll expand your universe on wine. Yes. So come visit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepak.
Bye.
Bye.